I think my favorite memory of Washington, D.C. was in a really grungy, slimy basement dive bar that was hosting a karaoke night. And I and the woman I was with went so hard on a screamo version of Ironic by Alanis Morissette. We smashed a bunch of glasses onto the floor, and everybody had to clear the floor to get it cleaned up.
Yeah. Well, let's start the show.
Great.
Hello, and welcome to Expected Own Goals, I See What DC edition. I am your host, Eric Morgan.
I'm Evan Davis. Welcome to part 2 of NWSL season preview week over here at XOG. We talked about the Orlando Pride yesterday, and today we have the Washington Post's Ella Brockway, who's also one of the co-hosts of the Hey Spirits podcast, the best podcast you can listen to, devoted exclusively to Washington Spirit content. Join us to break down a roster that, was more difficult to find fault with than a lot of other teams that we've previewed this year.
What they are doing in DC with the Washington Spirit is remarkable. I think it's possible the only foot they have put wrong in a long time is that highlighter jersey, and frankly, I don't even really hate that.
Yeah, go with Christ, Michelle Kang, if that's where your design sense is. We'll let you have this one if you are going to give Mark Krikorian the money to build a roster like this. So let's not waste any more time and get right to our conversation about the Washington Spirit with Ella Brockway of the Washington Post. We are joined by reporter and editor for the Washington Post and co-host of probably the best spirit-based podcast you can find, Hey Spirits. It's Ella Brockway. Ella, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe we're this close to another NWSL season getting underway.
Please don't remind us. So much work to do.
So much.
So this team got literally a goal or two away from lifting a second trophy back in November when they lost the NWSL championship to the Kansas City Current. By basically any metric you can name, they were, as advertised, tied for second on points, fourth on expected points, third on goal differential, third on XG differential, and yet just came up short. Do you get the sense that perversely this team felt like that was a failure last year?
I think they did, and I think that was part of the reason why a lot of us who covered the Spirit regularly were kind of shocked to hear at the end of the season, like, oh, this was a failure to us, or like, we're not satisfied with how that season went, when a lot of us observing were like, okay, this was the greatest regular season in club history, remarkable breakout seasons for players across the board, a truly remarkable run at the end of the season when there were, it wasn't just the elephant in the room. It was like the storyline was that there were so many injuries that it was sort of remarkable the team made it out of the first round of the playoffs. And I think the fact that, in the hours after the championship game, in some of those early off-season settings where we were able to talk to Coach Jonah Heraldez or just speak to some players, there was a real sense of like, that was good, but we can do even better. And I think that says a lot about the confidence that the Spirit team has. And I don't mean that, I don't mean confidence in a sort of like cocky way or like an overconfident way, but I do think that the 2024 season gave this particular group a lot of confidence that they're like rolling right into 2025 with.
Going into 2024, we spoke with Andre Carlisle, who is,
my friend.
Your friend. He was quite hesitant to register positive outlook on the upcoming season. And when we spoke to him at the final, was pretty surprised that they were there. What was your feeling going into last season? It's
so interesting because something I remember talking to Spirit general manager Mark Krikorian before last season started. And one of the things he said to me was, I'm fully aware that this team may not be its best self until all of our pieces can come into place. But we still think we're going to be pretty good in the meantime. And, I took the first half of that sentence, I was like, I agree with that. And then I approached the second half of that sentence with a little bit of skepticism because this was, a club whose coach wasn't going to join until the midpoint of the season, a general team, a general squad that was pretty young, had, 6 rookies on the roster who were, all of whom were asked to play like pretty important roles even at the beginning part of the season. And so I think I I thought the Spirit could contend because I think, it had players like Trinity Rodman. It had players who were really, hyped coming out of the college ranks like Corey Bethune. I thought it was going to be able to contend, but I did not think, a second place finish in the league was anywhere in the cards. And then it was really that first half of the season, when that team started to get into its rhythm 5 or 6 games in, when it really started to look like players such as Corey Bethune and Hal Hirschfeld were ready to like hit the ground running in the NWSL, even though it was their first season. That was when I started to think like, okay, yeah, this team can do more than contend. This team can like really make a crack at finishing in, the top 4 of this league. And then, Jonah Heraldez arrives in the summer. The Spirit makes some, bigger international signings from abroad. And I think that was when, around that August point coming out of the Olympics was when I started to think, okay, this team can win an NWSL title. And they obviously came within 1 goal of that.
You mentioned the transition from interim head coach Adrian Gonzalez to Jonah Heraldez when he came over from Barcelona in the summer. Do you get the impression from the team, which likes to represent itself as one of being really dedicated to process and getting things right for the long term, do you get a sense from the team, from Krikorian, maybe from Heraldez himself, that this transition went the way that they expected it to, or maybe that it took a left or a right turn for good or bad once Heraldez took over the team and transitioned to him running things?
I think there definitely was a transition point in the Spirit season last year. I don't necessarily think it was like with Heraldez's arrival. I think the fact that there were so many injuries at the end of last season, and just to, if you weren't following the Spirit super closely, Corey Bethune was the first major injury. She was in the middle of a Rookie of the Year campaign, tore her meniscus. And then sort of in the weeks after that, you see Trinity Rodman go down with a back injury that sort of plagued her all the way through the NWSL final. Leading scorer Ule Sarr was battling a back injury and still is. Andy Sullivan goes down with an ACL injury. They had, instances where Casey Kruger was missing a few games. So the injuries sort of just took the season in a different direction. And I don't think, so, when I talk about transition moment near the end point of last season, I think it was, Jonah Heraldez arrived and he clearly had a plan and a system that was able to be implemented in some ways, but the amount of injuries and like the personnel decisions that forced, I think, was what marked like a turning point for the Spirit. So I think in the broader sense, there have been very limited opportunities where we've seen this team at like its full strength, and kind of going back to what Mark Krikorian said, seeing this team at like with all its best players on the field, with all its, best coaches on the sidelines. I think there have only been a few instances where we've seen that. And the fact that, Heraldez in his first 2 months in the NWSL was able to play like a completely rookie midfield, or like an all rookie midfield, or, play a player like Hal Hirschfeld at right back sometimes. Like that, I think the fact that he was able to make those adjustments was really impressive. And while I don't think that was, exactly what he had envisioned, like arriving from Barcelona for the back half of the season, I think the fact that he was able to guide like a run to the NWSL final with all of those factors was really impressive.
Heraldez had a reputation coming over here, a reputation that makes a total amount of sense, coming out of Barcelona, coming up through the Barcelona system. We all speculated, I think, how the team was going to play, what tactical approach it was going to take because of that history that Heraldez had at Barca. Did the league change Heraldez at all, do you think? Or has he talked about that in those 10 games he had in the regular season once he arrived?
I think we don't. I'm not sure how much we've seen like Jonah Heraldez from Barcelona. And maybe I'm explaining this poorly, but I think because of all those injuries and where they were coming in the point of the season, there were games at the end of that regular season where, players who had mostly ridden the bench for the whole regular season were suddenly starting. And the Spirit's, those final 10 games of the season sort of became just about like, okay, let's hope we survive this game, maybe get a point or two, and don't get any more injuries, because we need as healthy of a team as we can get for the final. So I think, when we heard the news of Jonah Heraldo's coming to the US, we were sort of all envisioning this beautiful possession-based system, using passing as form of progression, smart spacing, short passing distances, all these things that we were like kind of used to visually seeing with Barcelona. I don't know if we were able to see that in his full 10 or, in the 10 plus games that he was able to coach with the Spirit, mainly because of how circumstances and injuries dictated who he was able to put on the field. So I think one of the most intriguing things about 2025 is sort of seeing, when the Spirit will have a mostly full roster or a mostly healthy roster at some point. I don't know when that will fully be, as I'm sure we'll talk about. When all the pieces that he wants are into place, when the broader squad as a whole has a whole preseason of playing in his system and playing the way he wants to under its belt, rather than just sort of, we need to win this game so that we can be in a good spot for the playoffs coming up. I think this season is the one where we'll really see, those sort of ideas and that vision implemented.
Do you think there is an element of stylistic compromise that Jonathan Heraldes will inevitably be forced to accept as a coach in this league that maybe he's not all the way toward accepting yet? Or do you think he can actually implement the Barcelona style and have it work here?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think when he came in and, this was something we heard from both him and from Mark Krikorian when the hiring became official was, we're not expecting him to do Barcelona 2.0 or even like Barcelona Light here in the NWSL. It's a different league. The amount of the players who are playing for the Spirit are different than what he was getting at Barcelona. In Barcelona, a lot of those players are Spanish. The core of that squad is Spanish and has been playing a particular style and a particular system in a way that, the 20 plus players on the Spirit roster are all coming from different countries, different soccer backgrounds, different, exposure to tactics. Some of the players, on this year's squad are coming from Europe and are very familiar with sort of, how Barcelona played. Other players are, in their first year in the NWSL and are very unfamiliar with what, the game looks like in Europe. So I think there was sort of an acknowledgement when Heraldes arrived that, he wasn't going to be able to just run it like Barcelona in the NWSL, if that makes sense. But at the same time, I do think, there were certain glimpses that we saw last season of how he wanted, the style of soccer he wanted to play and how he wanted players to, think about spacing, how he wanted players to think about, a phrase that he uses a lot is tactical harmony. So, kind of you want your attack to be comfortable enough in its structure so that you can progress the ball through passing and move through those blocks while also, maintaining your shape and your balance when you lose the ball. So I think we saw glimpses of that last season and glimpses of the style of soccer and sort of, the Barcelona style system. But just given the circumstances of both, the player personnel that he's using, the differences between the NWSL and the Spanish league or just Europe in general, I don't think there was any sort of expectation that he was going to, come in and make this team into Barcelona of the US or anything like that.
Is there a player you think that will directly benefit from year 2 of Heraldes' tactics? And do you think there's a player that might really regress or struggle under sort of an evolved Jonathan Heraldes tactical setup?
That's a good question. He brought over Adrián González, and Adrián González started implementing this system last preseason. So it's not as if, and I don't think that's what anyone was implying, but it's not as if, the system arrived when Heraldes arrived. This is a system that's now, well into its second season, of being implemented. And I think the majority of the players on the Spirit, adjusted pretty well to it. Even, there were some players who we had question marks about. We weren't sure how, a center back in her second or third year, whatever it was, Tara McKeown would adjust, and she produced a season that, won her or earned her a nomination for Defender of the Year. I think when I think of players who could have a lot of success for the Spirit in, with a full year of this system and just, this coaching staff into it, I think of a player like Rose Kouassi. She joined the Spirit last summer, and it seemed like the initial plan was to sort of have her as an impact player, getting, limited minutes off the bench, but bringing a real jolt of speed and energy late in these games. And she had a very promising end of the season, but, a promising end of the season where she was, because of the injury situation, she was, forced to become an immediate starter. And she's a very young player. Like, this was her first year in the NWSL. So there was definitely like an adjustment period to that. But we never got to see her score a goal. I think she had 2 assists, but she never quite like made it past the goal mark. And I think, we've seen with previous players on the Spirit, once they sort of get that first goal or that, that first goal, essentially, that can sort of be a breakthrough moment where the confidence can follow. And I think there are questions about how much or like what ways Rose Kouassi will feature in the Spirit's, plans this season. But I think she's a player who will sort of break out once she gets the confidence of just having scored that first NWSL goal under her belt. And I think a lot of what we saw last year with her in, on the wing, on that forward line was very promising.
We here at XOG are big Kouassi fans, and
we agree.
You look at her underlying data, and she was, bar none, the best player in the NWSL who didn't score a goal.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of when, not a matter of if. So let's keep pivoting into 2025. Traditionally, teams who make it to championships don't turn over large portions of their roster the next offseason. Washington's following a similar pattern. I count maybe 3 players who they brought in the offseason who could potentially make a big impact in 2025. So let's go through them, starting with Narumi Mira, who is a direct result of Andy Sullivan tearing her ACL at the end of the year. Narumi, I would have to assume, is going straight into the starting 11. What have you sensed from Krikorian and Giraldez about what they really like about Narumi and how she can fit into the way that the Spirit play now?
Yeah, I think the biggest area of need for this offseason was a defensive midfielder after the Andy Sullivan ACL injury in October. And then obviously, she just announced recently that she's pregnant, which is such exciting news, but that also means she's going to be out for pretty much all of 2025. So the Spirit moved very quickly to fill that hole. And I think she's, she spent the past 2 seasons with the North Carolina Courage. She's a very natural fit for that position. And having her in the number 6 role is something that also can free up Hal Hirschfeld to return to more of her, role as a number 8, like as more of a box-to-box midfielder, which is, I think, where she's found the most of her success in her NWSL career so far. But after the Andy Sullivan injury, she sort of, as the Spirit went through, multiple formation tweaks to sort of adjust to the injury absences, we saw Hal Hirschfeld playing, sometimes as like a lone 6, sometimes just in a more like deep-lying defensive position than I think is where she's best. And I think Narumi Miura is a really smart tackler and a passer and is very good at playing off of people. And she's gotten a ton of compliments from other Spirit players this offseason just about how she's, fit into the team on the field, obviously, and, how she's standing out in that sense, but also off the field. Casey Kruger was raving about her in a media availability last week, as was Croy Bethune. So I think she's the most significant addition of this offseason, and also a player I'm just really interested to see join this group.
We talked about a little off air about the status of Rebecca Bernal coming over from CF Monterrey in Mexico. Where does she fit into the starting 11, given that, as you mentioned earlier, Tara McKeown has really planted a flag as one of the starting center backs in Washington, but you also have the young Esme Morgan, who made a very good showing of herself in her limited time with Washington at the end of the season when she joined. So how is Giraldez planning to balance his central defense depth chart with Bernal? And what does Bernal potentially offer that Morgan and McKeown can't?
Yeah, I think Tara McKeown, she was an Iron Woman last season. She was a Defender of the Year nominee. She earned her first national team call-ups that we watched last week. And I think she's sort of a lock for one of those center back positions. But, Esme Morgan is still very new to the NWSL. She played in 6 matches, I think, was what she totaled out at last year. But there were still moments when you could see her adjusting to NWSL play and just to the pace and the speed of NWSL in comparison to, the English league that she came from before. So I think Esme Morgan, she signed on a long-term deal. So I think the Spirit has hopes for her long-term future in Washington. But at the same time, it wanted another center back for that group of three. And that was something we saw. The Spirit had 3 consistent center backs by the end of last season in Tara Esme and Anna Butel. And this Brunel signing is really interesting. She's a player who has a reputation of winning. She won 4 titles with Monterrey and in Mexico, has captained the Mexican national team. And when you look at her style of play, just, in terms of what she brings energy-wise and the versatility, she has played as both a center back and a defensive midfielder. I think we've seen her mostly as a defensive midfielder with with Mexico as of late, but she has said in some of those interviews that you mentioned with Mexican news outlets that her plan is to play as a center back here in DC. So she has that versatility. She has energy and possession. She has, a really powerful strike and shot from distance, which we've seen in, the form of long passes and also goal scoring. She's, a pretty impressive goal scorer for a center back as well. And, to give a shameless plug, we're hoping to go more in depth on her as a player on Hey Spirits when this news, ever becomes official on the American end. But I think Jonah Heraldez has spoken a lot about trying to go, 2 deep at different 2 to 3 deep at certain positions. And he really is someone who values competition in position groups at his team. And I think, when you look at all of the offseason additions or just the general offseason additions that this team has made, that is something that's, stretching throughout all of them is how can we increase, competition at goalkeeper? How can we increase competition at striker? And I think this signing plays into that. And she's, a big enough name that I wouldn't be surprised to see her, coming in as a starter right away for the Spirit.
I love this acquisition because I think it allows SB Morgan to also play left back or to play a back 3 at times. It allows Casey Kruger to play some right back if you want to spell Gabby Carl. The knock-on effects are incredible. And again, yeah, if you need a 6 in a pinch, you also have potentially an elite level 6 at your disposal. It seems like the Spirit make kind of nothing but savvy moves. Are there moves that you are hesitant about or are a little less certain of? Or are you just feeling pretty great?
If you talked to me at the start of this offseason, defensive mid and center back were like the 2 areas that I wanted to see something. I think there were, the Spirit only signed 2 players out of the college ranks this season. And obviously, it's been a different season, a different offseason because there's no NWSL draft. But the club signed Deborah Abedin, who's a Nigerian international. She played at Pitt the past few years. And then there Emma Gaines Ramos from San Diego State. And I think those were 2 interesting signings. And then we almost immediately saw Deborah Abedin go out on loan to the Super League. So she's going to spend the year at Dallas. So I think that was kind of, an interesting and another offseason signing, Tamara Bolt, who is a young Brazilian forward, but it seems like the Spirit wants to use her as a fullback. So those were like 2 intriguing signings that I wasn't quite sure exactly what the Spirit was going to do. But, their solution is to send them out on loan and see what kind of experience they can get there. I think the fact that there are 4 goalkeepers on the roster is right at the moment is certainly something interesting to me. I was not anticipating Sandy McKeever, I believe is how you pronounce her name, but she signed from Manchester City on a longer term deal. And it sounds like, just from what we've heard from Jonah Heraldez, it sounds like she was a player who has been on the Spirit's radar. And that is certainly an interesting signing for me, but you don't see many NWSL clubs rostering 4 goalkeepers at the same time. So I'm curious if there's like a loan move or something similar that's going to happen amongst those 4 keepers. But that is maybe the only thing this offseason that has sort of been, okay, every other move has been savvy. I'm not quite sure what is coming of this one yet.
Ashley Hatch put on a really good face last year and said she was just happy to do whatever the team asked her to do. But it was pretty clear that she was a square peg in a round hole for much of the year. Whether it was playing what essentially looked like left back at times, and being asked to do a lot of wide defensive work that she was not used to. It worked out toward the end of the year when injuries sort of forced her back into the forward line. But it was kind of, in certain ways, a season to forget for her just because of the way that she never seemed like she was fitting into the balance that first Gonzalez and then Heraldez wanted. But Ashley Hatch is Ashley Hatch. We know what we know what value she brings. But when Uli Madasar comes back and you have a permanent left-wing replacement in Rose Kouassi, where does Hatch go? What is Ashley Hatch's future, and how do you try and use her to maximum impact, knowing that you also have two players in Sarr and Kouassi who maybe fit Heraldez's tactical plans a little bit better than Hatch does?
I think this is a really tough area, for all the reasons that you mentioned, and especially because Ulay Sarr still has the season-ending injury designation, which means she's not occupying, a full roster spot. We haven't had any information on what stage of training return she's at, so it doesn't sound like the Spirit is expecting her back right away for, the Challenge Cup on March 7th, and then Ulay Sarr has been out with this injury since September 7th. So I think the question of how will she balance in there will sort of be something that how will Ashley Hatch and Ulay Sarr balance playing, the same position nominally? Like, that will be a question that the Spirit probably has to answer later in the season. And I would assume, at least for the first chunk of this season, we'd probably see something similar to what we saw at the end of last season, which is Ashley Hatch getting the starts up top, with players like Rose Kouassi and Trinity Rodman out wide. Because I think this team does see a lot of value in having both Ashley Hatch and Ulay Sarr available to start as strikers. I think, you mentioned it, but there was never really a situation where we were able to see both Sarr and Hatch on the field in a way that was like, getting the most out of both of them. And I think, that's almost kind of similar to, the Spirit found a way to get both Lacey Santos and Croy Bethune, who both nominally can be natural number 10s. You can have them on the field together in a way that just never exactly worked with Ashley Hatch and Ulay Sarr. So I think at least for the first chunk of the season, we'll probably see Ashley Hatch playing a lot of minutes and getting a lot of starts until Ulay Sarr is, able to come back. And then we might see an inverse of what we saw at the start of last season, which was, Ulay Sarr playing for the opening 70-ish minutes of a game and Hatch coming on for the final 20. And, she's still Ashley Hatch, even in that time when she wasn't starting. She was finding ways to get goals, create chances, and the Spirit likes having those as options. But, I think this sounds like a cop-out answer, but based on the situation, I think this is one where it may not, come to full boil until later in the season, just based on the injury history or the injury situation.
It also just gives a level of tactical flexibility that, like, you don't ever actually need to see Sarr and Hatch play together. Like, that is potentially never a problem. You just get different looks. But it feels like even with Sarr is a great off-the-ball runner, and players like Ashley Hatch know what to do with great off-the-ball runners, generally speaking. It feels like if you need to overload a team, that's kind of the only time in my read of it that you'd ever see them on the field together.
When healthy, obviously Croy Bethune and Hal Hirschfelds are in ink. But this is a team that got 6 rookies at least 500 minutes last year, which is extraordinary. And even in short samples, none of them played badly, which is also extraordinary. Setting aside Bethune and Hirschfeld, between Courtney Brown, McKenna Morris, Heather Stainbrook, and Kate Wiesner, who do you see as being someone who will make not only an impact in terms of playing time, but also production on the field? Who of that 4 do you think really stands out for the future?
I think we saw glimpses of it last season, and maybe glimpses is putting it nicely, because she had multiple games where she had a goal and an assist and a penalty earned. But McKenna Morris is probably my answer for this. I think she, coming off the bench in some of those games late in last season, showed just, you always hear coaches talk about, we want players who come off the bench to be, game changers instead of substitutes. And like, that's a little coach speak, but at the same time, McKenna Morris was a player who was changing games when she came off the bench. And, she's another player who has real positional flexibility in terms of, like, she played fullback, she played outside back in college and has been called up to, the national team futures camp as an outside back again. But she anticipates this season, at least from what we heard, that she'll be playing more as a forward. So I think, when you look at the list of those other 4 rookies, she was someone who clearly made an impact made the most of those, 500 or so minutes I think it was probably a little more than that, but she made an impact in the game situations that she was able to come in this year and last season. And I think, this season I would anticipate even more of that.
Okay, we've got to get to the elephant in the room at some point. Trinity Rodman, big contract season coming up. Seems to be, I don't know, a cloud hanging over the future of the Washington Spirit.
And over the league.
How much do you expect that storyline to drag out throughout the season? Or do you think that there's a resolution coming sooner than we think?
I think it was certainly amusing, at least one of like the points of this Spirit's offseason before, it was a relatively quiet Spirit offseason until, the Narumi signings, the eventually Bernal signings. But there was a moment where the biggest Spirit plotline was like, is Trinity Rodman secretly signed for Arsenal? And we don't even know. So that at least gave everyone some amusement in a relatively quiet offseason. But I do think, she's a player who's held in really high acclaim around the world. And a lot of teams are obviously going to be monitoring this season and interested in her service. I think if you're the Spirit, you probably have to approach this season aware that is hovering over this. And, I think that we've always heard a lot of Spirit fans calling for let's sign this player from Barcelona, or let's sign this player from the WSL. I think that's part of the fact that contract is something that I think the Spirit will want to, keeping Trinity Rodman in DC is something that the Spirit will want to do. Maybe part of the reason why we don't see, a huge, big, splashy summer signing after the Euros or something of that. I think, speaking as someone who has, covered her for the past few years, I think the NWSL is a place where Trinity Rodman likes playing, and Washington specifically is a place where she's been able to thrive and has, will probably be able to continue thriving in this system. And I think it's fair to say that she's the face of this club and the face of, quite frankly, soccer in Washington at this moment in time. And I think it's going to be a high priority, the highest of priorities for the Spirit to get her re-signed. But at the same time, I think we're going to see a lot of transfer rumors flying around. I think we're going to see a real competition if that doesn't happen right away. And I think that is certainly going to be something that, we might not feel it in April, but by come the end of the season, it's something that's definitely going to be hovering over this season.
I'll ask the question that I asked all last preseason. Put yourself in Jonathan Heraldez' shoes. What is keeping you up late at night as you enter the season? What is the thing that you are most stressed about if you are Jonathan?
This is not going to be, I don't know if he's thinking about it in this exact terms, but something we talked a lot about on Hey Spirits last year is this is not a guy who is used to losing games. You look at his resume and his record at Barcelona, and it was something I think his total losses at Barcelona, games he had overseen that ended in a defeat, were fewer than 10. And I think the fact that the Spirit lost the NWSL final is what keeps him up at night. I think he is someone who likes to win, someone who likes to win and is not used to losing. And, he came into the NWSL with a mindset of we will do everything that we can to win, and we will be disappointed. Or I sat in his press conferences after defeats last year, and he was very quiet after losses and not a big, moral victory and a loss kind of guy. And I think the fact that this season did not end with a trophy in the way that they envisioned is probably what keeps him up at night. And I think we'll see that, right out of the gate this season.
Standing next to another Washington Spirit reporter, Jason Anderson, in the post-match press conference after that championship loss. And I think Heraldez spoke 8 words that whole thing. He was not a happy man. So I can certainly buy that hunger from him. All right, now is the moment of truth.
Yes.
We're not going to hold you to this. By the end of the season, I think Eric and I both, and Andre, I think we all pegged Washington to finish 5th last year. Obviously, they end up tied for 2nd on points. Give us a table finish. Where at the end of the regular season are the Washington Spirit sitting?
Is it a cop-out to say 1st to 3rd? Do I have to give an exact number? Because I think...
Even if you just pluck it out of the air, if that's what makes you the most comfortable, yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to pick second in the middle of those because I think it's somewhere in the first to third range, but I'm not sure exactly where. So I'm just going to say second, even though that's the same thing that happened last year. But I do think, like, I feel comfortable making a prediction that this team can finish somewhere in the top three. I will say the top two. I think this roster showed us its talent level last season. And, you don't see every year a team returning every single player who started during a playoff run. And that is what this Washington team is doing. And I think, especially in a league that's very, even in the sense that every game is a battle and that it's a long season to get through, having talent stockpiled can give you a big boost, whether that's, like a consistent starting 11 or, really talented players coming off the bench. And I think this Spirit team is, everything we've heard from this offseason is they feel like they're even better than they were last year. And that's confidence speaking, but that's also, on paper, this is a pretty darn good team. So that's what I'll land at.
I mean, I'll stick my neck out even further than you. I think this is the Shield winner for 2025.
I also have them as the Shield winner for 2025. Evan and I do not reveal our rankings to each other. We just do this episode by episode. And I was curious. I was waffling between 1 and 2, and I just think the tremendous amount of squad depth plus the minutes lost to injury last year, if the team even only suffers 60% of that loss, this is a much improved team. Also with everyone on the right side of the age curve. I think I understood immediately when you wanted to hedge between first and third. It's hard to say that about your own team, but I don't think it's crazy to say first either. So we have a first, and a second from us here. That's starting off with a bang.
Yeah, and anybody who is annoyed with Ella by the end of the year, please don't at her. I don't want that in her life.
I don't take responsibility if that prediction goes haywire.
It's exactly.
Ella was the only one of us that showed any level of restraint. So if you're going to come for someone, don't come for the person who lives and breathes with this team. Come for the people who are dumb enough to just say, yeah, first.
Yeah. You can find Ella's work at The Washington Post, and you can follow her on social media at Ella Brockway. And please listen to Hey Spirits every single week for the best Washington Spirit coverage in the business. Ella, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. That was Ella Brockway, who was fantastic. I thought she stopped a little short of picking, them to be the outright Shield winners. Because she is a cautious fan.
That's superstition. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can't blame her.
We were not so prudent in our judgments. Evan, I'm going to ask you, 90, 50, 10. What is the 90th percentile outcome for the Washington Spirit? What is the 50th? What is the 10th?
90th percentile is they have an invincible season and do the double. 50th is just winning the Shield and just doing the double, you poor things. And 10th percentile, God. 4th, and that even feels rude to say.
Yeah. I think their 90th is, you're approaching an invincible season. They set the points record. It's something on that order. Knockout football is knockout football, but the double. 50th is probably winning the Shield and giving it a fighting chance in the crazy knockout playoffs. But the double is not outside the realm of that either. And I think the 10th percentile, God, if everything were to go wrong, it's maybe 5th. It's like, that requires everything to go right for other people too.
Exactly. And the level of depth that they have, because 10th percentile involves Trinity Rodman throwing her back out and being unavailable for the entire season. Well, guess what? Yeah. They got a lot of attacking depth who have proven themselves at the professional level.
The crazy thing is they went to the NWSL final last year with half of their attack injured.
And half of a Trinity Rodman.
Yeah, and like a partial Trinity Rodman. Yeah. So the 10th percentile for them is still a very good team.
Exactly. So hat tip to Spirit fans. Hope we haven't jinxed you. And for the rest of the league, we pray for you. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend. Enjoy the Challenge Cup tonight.
The Challenge Cup on Amazon.
Enjoy the Challenge Cup tonight at Entering Coast Stadium in Orlando on Amazon Prime. In the meantime, we will be back with more NWSL season preview week on Monday. Until then, Follow us, rate us 5 stars, drop a review in your podcatcher of choice. Join our Patreon if you haven't already. Only $6 a month or $60 a year gets you 4 bonus episodes every single month, as well as access to our Discord server and our semi-regular YouTube live streams.
Guys, the Discord community is great. And for the Spirit fans listening to this, there's an entire channel dedicated to Hal Hirschfeld.
There you go.
And just Hal Hirschfeld love.
Follow us on social media at XOwnGoals. That's the letter X Own Goals. If you believe we've made an own goal, please email us at expectedowngoals@gmail.com. That's the letter expectedowngoals@gmail.com. We will join you for the rest of NWSL season preview week on Monday.
Bye.